Welcome. If you have been following this channel long enough, you know that the quietest moves carry the sharpest edges. What separates this case from everything we have covered before is that the protagonist did not fight to keep her charges in court. She let them go, deliberately, with her eyes open. That single act of apparent surrender became the architecture of a 10-year sentence for someone else. Welcome to Historical Manhwa. The recycled air inside Conference Room B smelled like cold coffee and old paper, and the particular chemical sharpness of a fresh toner cartridge. Nora Lim noticed these things the way she always noticed everything. Calmly, precisely, and without giving any of it the satisfaction of being remembered as meaningful. She sat with her hands folded on the lacquered table and did not look at the document in front of her because she had already read it 4 times that morning and she knew exactly what it said. She knew what every clause meant, what every waiver implied, and what the downstream legal consequences of her signature would set into motion. She knew all of it. That was the point. The document was a voluntary dismissal of charges. Criminal case number 2021-CF-004871. The People versus Celine Whitmore. Theft by unlawful taking. Is aggravated fraud, forgery, and wire fraud across state lines. 47 pages of evidence that Nora had spent 9 months assembling with the precision of a woman who had spent 14 years learning exactly how financial crimes were concealed and exactly how they were uncovered. She was going to sign it anyway. Across the table, Raymond Whitmore sat with the practiced stillness of a man who had spent decades in rooms where stillness was currency. He was 63, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than Nora's first car, and he had the kind of face that never showed what it was calculating. His attorney, a pale-haired man named Forster, sat to his left and had not spoken in 11 minutes. Raymond had not needed him to speak. Raymond had said everything that needed to be said in the meeting that had happened before this meeting, in the oak-paneled office 17 floors above this room, where Gabriel had been seated across from his uncle and had listened to Raymond explain, quietly and without any particular emotion, what would happen to Gabriel's career, to the firm's banking relationships, to the Whitmore family's continued investment in 14 joint properties they co-held with Gabriel's development company if this case proceeded to trial. Gabriel had not argued. He had come home that night and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Nora with an expression that was not quite guilt and not quite pleading, and was instead that particular brand of weak that she had been watching calcify in him for the past 3 years. And he had said, "Nora, she's family." Nora had looked at him for a long moment. She had looked at the man she had married 8 years ago, the man she had built a business beside, the man whose cousin had spent 22 months systematically draining $860,000 from that business through a network of ghost vendors, falsified expense reports, and forged wire transfer authorizations bearing Nora's digital signature. She had looked at him and she had understood, completely and without drama, what kind of man he was and what kind of marriage this was and what was about to happen. She had also, in that same moment, understood something about Raymond Whitmore that she suspected Raymond himself did not see clearly, that his protection of Selene was not purely familial love. Always it was the protection of a man who had spent 30 years building a family's financial and reputational architecture and who understood, at the level of pure structural logic, that a criminal trial of Selene Whitmore would produce discovery that would examine the Whitmore family's financial relationships in granular detail. The civil restitution suit was already doing some of that work, but a criminal trial would be more expansive, more public, and harder to shape. The DA's investigative process might surface relationships and transactions that Raymond had organized with the assumption of privacy that 4 decades of controlled information management had made him comfortable relying upon. Raymond Whitmore did not want Selene in a criminal trial. He wanted her managed, quietly, in a civil box. She had thought about this from multiple angles in the 4 days between Gabriel's kitchen conversation and Conference Room B. She had considered whether pursuing the criminal case despite the family pressure offered advantages that outweighed the risks of Gabriel's non-cooperation and the potential destabilization of the firm's banking relationships. Her analysis was that it did not because she doubted the strength of the case, which was strong, but because a contested trial in which the defendant's family was actively hostile to the victim would be lengthy, expensive, and emotionally corrosive in ways that would compound the harm already done. She would win, probably. She would also spend the next 18 to 24 months of her professional life being deposed, cross-examined, and then managed by attorneys whose full-time job was to make her look unreliable. More importantly, a criminal conviction with a full trial record created a specific kind of closure that worked against what she was beginning to understand she actually wanted. A conviction was an ending. What she was building toward was a different structure. She wanted the record to remain open in exactly the way that a civil judgment with a dropped criminal complaint leaves it open. Available, unsettled, and waiting for the next event that would give it new meaning. She had also researched, in those 4 days, the specific provision of the Federal Rules of Evidence governing prior bad acts, Rule 404B, and its state equivalent in their jurisdiction. Under those rules, evidence of a prior bad act that did not result in a conviction could be admitted to show motive, opportunity, intent, preparation, plan, knowledge, identity, or absence of mistake. A prior conviction, by contrast, opened a different and more contested set of evidentiary arguments that gave a skilled defense attorney substantially more to work with. She was not a criminal attorney. She read the rule and the relevant case law with the careful comprehension of someone who is learning a technical system for a specific applied purpose. She understood what she was reading. She updated her analysis accordingly. The dropped criminal complaint, with its preserved civil judgment, was not a defeat with a silver lining. It was the instrument she had decided to build the next phase around. Also, it left the 2021 conduct legally available as prior act evidence if new conduct emerged. It left Celine with a probation record and a court-ordered supervision structure. It left Raymond Whitmore feeling that he had managed the situation, which meant he would not spend the next 2 years actively working to prevent the next phase. It left her free to watch. Okay, she had said. That was all. He had looked relieved, which told her everything she needed to know about whether he understood what he was looking at. Now, in conference room B, Nora uncapped the pen. It was a ballpoint, blue ink, the kind that left no trace of pressure variance that could later be used to argue duress. She had chosen it deliberately from the supply closet 2 floors down, having rejected the heavier rollerball that Forster's paralegal had laid out. I need a heavy pen pressed harder into paper. Pressure analysis was a real science. Nora knew that because she had used it twice in professional capacity to identify forged signatures in financial documents. She was not going to be the woman who signed under duress. She was going to be the woman who signed with complete and documented freedom of choice. She signed. The sound of the pen crossing paper was negligible. Less than a whisper, more than nothing. Raymond Whitmore allowed himself one slow exhale. Forster immediately began gathering documents. The 2 associates who had been stationed near the door like decorative objects began moving with sudden purpose. Nora recapped the pen and set it parallel to the table edge and looked at Raymond for the first time since sitting down. I assume, she said, that Celine understands the terms of the plea arrangement she's accepted. Raymond's eyes were the color of weathered concrete. 18 months probation, community service, restitution payments scheduled over 3 years. I'm aware of what it says on paper, Nora said. I'm asking whether she understands it. A pause. Raymond studied her with the expression of a man reassessing an instrument he'd thought was simple. She understands. Nora nodded once, the way you nod when you have already moved past the conversation you are currently finishing. She collected her copy of the dismissal, slid it into the leather portfolio she'd carried in, and stood. She was wearing a navy blazer over a gray shirt. No jewelry except small gold studs. Flat shoes. It's because she had not been able to predict how long she would be standing, and she had long since stopped performing discomfort for audiences. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the lobby button. She rode down 22 floors in silence, listening to the faint mechanical complaint of the cable above her, and when the doors opened, she walked through the building's glass atrium and out onto the street, and stood for a moment in the thin February light with car exhaust cutting through cold air. And then she took her phone out and opened the secure encrypted notes application she had downloaded 4 days earlier from a developer whose privacy architecture she had verified personally. She typed 2 words. Clock starts. She put the phone away and walked to the parking structure. She had met Celine Whitmore 11 years ago in the conference room of a different kind. It had been a deposition, a forensic audit dispute for a mid-sized pharmaceutical distribution company, and Nora had been the external forensic accountant brought in to review 2 years of accounts receivable records. Celine had been the company's internal finance director, 29 years old, with the kind of confidence that reads as competence to people who don't know the difference. She had walked Nora through the records with fluency and ease, flagging discrepancies before Nora could find them herself, offering explanations that were technically accurate and narratively coherent. Nora had thought, this woman knows exactly where the bodies are because she put them there. She had been wrong, as it turned out. Celine had actually been clean at that job. The discrepancies were a predecessor's mess, and Celine had spent 8 months quietly correcting them without formal credit. Nora had verified this independently. She had also noted something she did not often see. Celine Whitmore worked with the kind of methodical intelligence that only exists in people who genuinely understand financial architecture, not just its surface appearance. They had gone for coffee afterward, then dinner 3 weeks later, then a professional friendship that sharpened over 5 years into something that felt like partnership, the kind built on mutual respect and compatible professional ethics, and the particular chemistry that happens when two women who are very good at the same thing find each other in a room full of men who are merely average at it. Nora had been building her own practice by then, forensic consulting, primarily for corporate litigation and insurance fraud. Gabriel had been in real estate development. The natural intersection of their professional networks had produced, almost organically, the company they eventually named Limgrave Advisory Group. Nora as principal forensic specialist and managing director. Gabriel as co-founder with operational oversight of the real estate portfolio arm. And Celine, brought in at Nora's insistence and over Gabriel's mild reservations, as CFO. That had been 3.5 years ago. Celine had been stealing from them within 4 months of taking the role. Nora had not discovered it for another 14 months, which was the fact that she returned to periodically in the way you press a bruise. Oh, not because it produces anything useful, but because the examination of your own failure is the only way to make sure you do not repeat it. She was a forensic accountant. She was supposed to find things. The professional embarrassment of not finding this was substantial, and she was honest enough with herself to sit with it rather than construct comfortable explanations. What she eventually reconstructed, working backward from the first anomaly she noticed in month 19, was a fraud architecture of genuine sophistication. Celine had not simply moved money. She had built a layered system across 3 entities. A legitimate-seeming vendor called Brightfield Consulting Services, registered in Delaware with a generic address, and a real phone number that rolled to a voicemail service. A secondary LLC called GSF Management Solutions, registered in Wyoming under a nominee name that traced back, with difficulty, to a university friend of Celine's who had apparently signed paperwork without fully understanding what he was signing. And a third structure, a dormant company that Celine had reactivated from a previous corporate existence called Marengo Group, which had a 2-year history of legitimate transactions that made it look established to any cursory review. Expenses had been routed through all 3 entities in a rotation designed to avoid pattern detection. Brightfield invoiced for strategic consulting retainers. GSF billed for data infrastructure management. Marengo submitted expense reimbursements against fabricated project codes. And on the dollar amounts per transaction had been carefully calibrated to stay under the internal approval threshold that required Nora's direct sign-off, which meant the transactions had been processed by the accounts payable function that reported to Celine. The wire transfer authorizations bearing Nora's digital signature were the most elegant part of the construction. Celine had obtained Nora's signature key access through a process that Nora, retrospectively, could identify exactly. A software update request that had gone through IT, approved by Celine as CFO, which had required a brief period of shared administrative access during migration. The shared access window had been 48 hours. Celine had used 11 of those hours, spread across 3 separate sessions, to export the signature key parameters to an external device. Nora had understood, when she mapped this out, that she was looking at the work of someone who had planned it before she ever accepted the job. That was the thing that had burned in the weeks after she found it. Not the money, though the money was significant. Not even the years of shared coffee and professional trust, and the fact that she had once driven 2 hours to sit with Celine in a hospital waiting room when Celine's mother had been in surgery. It was the planning. The fact that Celine had walked into their first conversation about the CFO role, had listened to Nora explain the firm's structure and financial architecture, and had in the same mental process been cataloging the entry points. You can be betrayed by someone who loved you and then chose greed. That is a human tragedy with recognizable shapes. But to be betrayed by someone who saw you as an opportunity before the relationship was even fully formed, who performed friendship with investment and precision, whose warmth was a product of strategy rather than feeling, that is a different category of thing. It doesn't produce grief the way ordinary betrayal does. It produces something colder and more permanent. A recalibration. Nora had completed her recalibration in approximately 3 days. Then she had begun building the case. The evidence she assembled over the following 9 months was, by the time it reached the DA's office, almost operatically thorough. She had pulled every financial record. She had subpoenaed bank statements from Brightfield, GSF, and Marengo through the discovery process she'd initiated as a private litigant in the parallel civil suit she filed first. She had hired a digital forensics firm to reconstruct the signature key extraction event from server logs. She had located the nominee director of GSF management, a man named Todd Prescott, who taught high school chemistry in Portland, Oregon, and had documented that he had never received $1 from the entity and had signed the formation documents after Celine told him it was for a real estate investment club. Todd Prescott had cooperated without hesitation and with visible distress, and his signed affidavit was 41 pages long. She had also documented, because she was nothing if not complete, Celine's spending patterns during the period of the theft. Not because she needed it for the criminal case, but because she wanted the picture to be whole and undeniable. Celine had spent approximately half the stolen amount on things that were aesthetically invisible. She did not buy a flashy car or an ostentatious vacation. She had paid off a significant personal debt that had been accruing since a failed startup she'd run 5 years earlier. She had purchased an apartment in a quiet building across town, paying a down payment in cash through a structure that used Marengo as an intermediary. She had, in other words, spent the money on becoming secure, on erasing the financial precarity that she had apparently been carrying quietly beneath the surface of her competent professional presentation for years. Nora understood this, in the flat, analytical way she understood most things. It did not produce sympathy. It produced a cleaner picture. Yet when she had presented the full evidence package to the DA's office, the lead prosecutor had looked at her across the desk and said, "This is one of the cleaner fraud packages I've seen come through without a law enforcement investigation driving it." "I know," Nora had said. That had been 6 months before Conference Room B. Then Raymond Whitmore had made his phone call to Gabriel, and the machinery of family had ground its quiet gears, and Nora had sat in a kitchen doorway and heard "she's family," and understood what the next chapter of this required. The thing about signing the dismissal was not that it felt like defeat. Defeat is an emotion, and Nora had moved past the emotional register of this situation some months earlier. What the signing felt like was the beginning of the second phase, of something that had a very specific logical structure. And the logical structure required this phase to proceed in a particular sequence. She had thought about this carefully in the week before the signing. Not about whether to do it, which had been obvious to her within 24 hours of Gabriel's kitchen doorway speech, but about how to do it in a way that preserved and enhanced what came next. The core of the problem was this. Celine Whitmore had agreed to a plea arrangement that gave her 18 months probation and scheduled restitution payments. Probation meant she was a convicted person operating under court supervision. The terms of her probation, which Nora had read completely and annotated in her private notes, included specific prohibitions. She could not hold a fiduciary position. She could not have signatory authority over accounts exceeding $10,000. She was required to submit monthly financial disclosure reports to her probation officer. She was required to notify her PO of any new employment within 72 hours of starting. She was prohibited from applying for new credit without prior written permission from the court. These were not unusual terms for a fraud conviction. They were, in fact, fairly standard for this category of white-collar crime. Nora had read the terms with the particular attention of someone who was not reading them to understand what Celine could not do. She was reading them to understand which of those prohibitions, As given everything she knew about Celine Whitmore's psychology and financial architecture and the specific texture of her particular compulsions, Celine was most likely to violate. Because here was the thing about Celine that Raymond Whitmore and his expensive attorney did not know. Nora had known her for 11 years. She had watched her operate under financial pressure. She had watched her make decisions when she felt cornered or undervalued, or when she saw an opening that she was confident she could manage. Celine was not a risk-averse person. She was a person who had a highly calibrated sense of her own ability to manage risk, which is a different and considerably more dangerous thing. The sophisticated construction of the original fraud had not been the work of someone who was deeply cautious, and it had been the work of someone who trusted her own intelligence to the point of assuming it would always be sufficient. Celine Whitmore was, in the clinical sense, a person who could not watch an open door without walking through it. Nora was going to leave a door open. Not by doing anything. That was the elegant part of it. She was not going to manufacture anything or create any artificial opportunity or take any action that could later be characterized as entrapment. She was simply going to do her job very quietly, from a distance, while keeping her eyes on the particular set of financial signatures that Celine's previous activity had taught her to read. She was going to wait. And Celine, because she was Celine, was going to do the rest. There is a particular kind of thinking that financial forensics requires, and that almost no other professional discipline produces in quite the same configuration. It is not the quick, intuitive pattern recognition of a detective. It is not the methodical rule application of a compliance officer. It is something built at the intersection of those two modes, a slow, systematic patience that can sustain itself across weeks and months of apparent inactivity, combined with the ability to recognize, in a single anomalous data point, buried inside thousands of mundane ones, the specific shape of something being deliberately concealed. Nora had developed this thinking over 14 years. She had not started with it. She had started with a natural facility for numbers and an early instinct that financial documents were, like all human-produced artifacts, reflective of the intentions of the people who created them, and that the distance between documented intention and actual intention was where the interesting work lived. Her graduate training in forensic accounting had given this instinct structure and methodology. Her first 5 years of professional practice, working for a litigation support firm on cases that ranged from insurance fraud to corporate embezzlement to estate dispute accounting, had given the methodology texture and the specific kind of patience that only develops through repeated exposure to cases that look like they're going nowhere for months and then crack open in a single afternoon. She had a case that cracked open like that in her second year of practice. A family-owned real estate company, 3 brothers, one of whom had been systematically altering the firm's rent roll records for 4 years to skim from property management fees. The skim was modest per transaction, but consistent across hundreds of properties and had accumulated to something substantial. The brother had been doing it so long that he had apparently stopped thinking of it as theft and had begun thinking of it as his fair share of a company he believed he ran more effectively than his siblings. When Nora laid out the full forensic reconstruction in front of the family's attorney and the 2 non-defrauding brothers, there was a silence in the room that she had never forgotten. The specific quality of silence that happens when people who have trusted each other for decades suddenly understand that the trust was one-directional and has been for a long time. That silence was one of the things she had thought about in the days after discovering Celine's fraud. She had thought about it not as an emotional reference point, but as a professional one, as evidence that this kind of discovery always produces the same silence, regardless of the relationship's specifics, because what the silence contains is not just betrayal, but the reorganization of memory. Every warm moment now requires re-examination. Every act of apparent generosity has to be reread through the lens of what you now know. It is not that the moments become unreal, it is that their meaning changes retroactively, and the person doing the rereading has to decide how to carry that changed meaning without letting the reorganization consume the present. Nora had given herself 3 days for the reorganization. She thought this was roughly appropriate. Then she had closed the emotional ledger on it and opened the professional one. The professional one was where she spent most of her time anyway. During the months of the probation period, she had developed a monitoring routine that was precise enough to be sustainable without consuming her primary professional attention. Every Monday morning, before she opened client work, she spent 30 minutes checking the 4 monitoring streams she had established: the corporate registration database alert, the financial filing monitor, the professional licensing database for the state, and a curated search of public court records in the 3 states where Celine had operational or familial connections. Each of these streams produced mostly noise, which is the nature of monitoring. She had calibrated the alert parameters to minimize noise while preserving sensitivity to the specific signal patterns she was looking for. The logic of what she was looking for was built from what she knew about Celine's operational signature. Every financial criminal has a signature, a set of structural choices and behavioral patterns that recur across schemes because they reflect the individual's particular capabilities, risk tolerance, and psychological needs. Celine's signature included the use of formation agents in low-disclosure states, specifically Nevada and Wyoming, the preference for nominee directors who were personally connected to her rather than professional nominees, the use of generic, corporate-sounding entity names that did not flag for scrutiny, the targeting of approval thresholds as a primary risk management tool, and a behavioral pattern of patience in the grooming phase, followed by acceleration once trust was established. She had documented Celine's signature in a 14-page analytical memorandum that she had written for herself in the first month after the dismissal, not for any external purpose, but because writing the analysis forced a precision of thinking that internal reflection alone did not produce. The memorandum covered the operational elements of the fraud, the psychological underpinnings as she understood them, the likely trigger conditions for reoffending, and the specific indicators she would watch for. She had written it the way she would write a profile for a professional engagement, without sentiment, with specificity, and with an acknowledgement of the limitations of her analysis at each point where her evidence base was thinner than she would like. It was a good memorandum. When Marcus Chen eventually received her full documentation package, he had read it and called her separately to say that it read like a case profiling report from an experienced investigator. She had told him it was a tool for structuring her own thinking. He had been quiet for a moment and then said that it was more or less the same thing. She had not disagreed. She also, in those monitoring months, did something that might look from the outside like idleness, but was in fact a kind of active preparation. She read. Not casually, she read with professional purpose. Pulling legal reviews and academic papers and practitioner analyses focused on 3 specific areas that she had identified as likely to be relevant to what was coming. The first area was elder financial exploitation, its legal treatment, its patterns of execution, and the specific forensic challenges of documenting it in ways that satisfy evidentiary standards. The second area was probation violation law in her state, specifically the case law governing the revocation process and the evidential thresholds required. The third area was the intersection of state securities law and private investment solicitation, particularly the specific statutes governing unlicensed investment activity and the jurisdictional considerations when funds were transferred across state lines. She was not practicing law in this reading. She held a law license, but she was not Celine's prosecutor and had no intention of becoming one. What she was doing was ensuring that when the moment came, when she needed to communicate clearly with someone who would be doing the prosecuting, she understood the precise legal contours of what she was describing well enough to frame it usefully. She did not want to give Marcus a package that required him to explain to her why pieces of it were not actionable. She wanted to give him a package that was already shaped to the legal reality. This kind of preparation takes time. She gave it time. The day she received the first alert about Crestfield Advisory Solutions was a Tuesday in August at 7:40 in the morning, and she was in the middle of a conversation with a client about the reconstruction of a 4-year accounts payable record when the notification came through on her phone. She noted it, set the phone face down on the desk in a smooth motion that did not interrupt her sentence, and continued the conversation to its natural conclusion. When the client left, she looked at the notification for approximately 90 seconds, then opened her laptop and began the verification process. The verification process for a corporate registration hit was systematic. First, confirm the filing source, and ensure the alert has not captured a false positive due to a formation agent match on a legitimately unrelated entity. Second, review the entity's formation documents in full, noting all registered information including agent, organizer, address, all and any listed members or officers. Third, cross-reference each piece of identifying information against your existing documentation for known affiliated entities and persons. Fourth, assess the structural match to your established signature profile. Fifth, determine what additional public source information is available and whether it strengthens or weakens the initial pattern hypothesis. Only after these 5 steps was a preliminary assessment warranted. She completed the 5 steps over 2 mornings. Her preliminary assessment was probable match, confidence level 73%, not high enough to act, high enough to begin the next monitoring layer. She added a secondary alert for Crestfield specifically, set to capture any financial or legal filing that referenced the entity's name or the address of record. She also added a people search alert on the nominee name listed on the filing, a woman named Christine Alt, to track any professional or legal filings associated with that name in any jurisdiction. Christine Alt, she discovered within a week, had been Celine's college roommate for 2 years. This was documented in a 10-year-old alumni newsletter she found through a general search, which mentioned both of their names in the context of a university fundraising committee. The confidence level rose to 88%. She noted the update and continued waiting. The public court filing that surfaced the Castaway Trust transfer came in November, and it came embedded inside a document that had nothing to do with Celine or Crestfield, and that Nora would never have found through any search focused on those names. It appeared in the exhibits of a separate probate matter involving the Castaway Family Trust and a dispute among Herbert Castaway's adult children about trustee appointment, a dispute that had been filed in the probate court and was publicly accessible through the court's electronic filing system. One of the exhibits was a summary of the trust's recent transactions, submitted by the family attorney to document the trust's current financial state. In that transaction summary was a wire transfer reference, a date, an amount, and a receiving institution code. The receiving institution code traced to a Nevada bank. Nora searched the Nevada bank's public filings for correspondent institution relationships and found a connection to the account structure registered to Crestfield's formation address. And if the chain was long and the links were individually weak, together they told a story she recognized. She sat with this information for 2 weeks before calling Marcus, not because she was uncertain about what to do, but because she was careful about when to do it. The call needed to happen after she had structured the information properly and before Celine's activity at Alcott Meridian potentially generated an internal discovery that would put the matter in different hands. She was threading a window and she needed to thread it correctly. She called on a Thursday because she knew Marcus was in the office on Thursdays and had a standing schedule that left his afternoon open for substantive conversations. This was not information she was supposed to have. She had inferred it from the pattern of their 3 previous professional interactions over 2 years, all of which had been easy to schedule on Thursdays in the afternoon. It was a small thing. She was meticulous about small things. The period between Marcus's investigation beginning and Celine's arrest was the most internally demanding phase of the entire sequence, because it was the phase during which Nora had the least control over the outcome and the most comprehensive understanding of what the outcome should be. She knew what the evidence showed. She knew the legal theory. She knew the strength of the case. What she did not control was whether Marcus's unit would pursue it with the vigor it deserved, whether the federal component would engage, whether Herbert Castaway's family would cooperate, and whether Celine's attorney would successfully argue the matter into a plea arrangement before a full case was built. She had one tool for managing this uncertainty, and she used it with precision: her documentation package. The 294 pages she delivered to Marcus's office were not intended to tell him what to investigate. They were intended to tell him what the investigation should find and how to find it efficiently. Every document in the package had a source citation. Every analytical memorandum explained its own evidentiary basis. The cross-reference index at the front allowed any investigator to locate, within seconds, the documentation relevant to any specific element of the case. She had built it, in other words, to make his job easier in exactly the way that mattered. not by doing his job for him, which would have raised the chain of custody problem she was carefully avoiding, but by organizing her own legal observations in a way that served as a map for his independent investigation. Marcus understood this when he received it. He did not say so explicitly, but she could tell from the specific nature of his follow-up questions, which were targeted precisely at the analytical gaps in her memoranda rather than at the factual foundation, that he had read the package carefully and understood its structure. He was asking the questions she would have asked if she had been reading her own work from the outside. She answered his questions with the same precision she had used to compile the documentation. She gave him what he needed, and nothing he didn't. She trusted him to do the investigative work that only he was positioned to do. Well, he did it well. She had expected nothing less. The moment she received the call telling her Celine had been arrested, she was in her car in a parking structure, returning from a client site meeting. She had finished a call with Marcus's paralegal confirming the timing of her documentation delivery and had been planning to get lunch. She sat in the parking structure for approximately 3 minutes after the call ended, with the engine running and the garage air pressing in around her, and the particular fluorescent flatness of underground parking making everything look slightly artificial, and then she put the car in drive and pulled out into the daylight and went to get lunch. She ate a bowl of ramen from a restaurant 3 blocks from her office. It was Tuesday, which was the day they made the tonkatsu broth from scratch. And the broth was the best thing she had eaten in several weeks. She sat at the counter and ate it with the methodical pleasure of someone who has remembered, briefly, that food is one of the uncomplicated good things. She noted this. Then she paid and walked back to the office and sent Priscilla Osai's firm a message about beginning the business dissolution filing process they had discussed. Phase 2 was complete. Other things needed attention. The trial, when it came, was both more and less dramatic than such events are represented in popular imagination. Less, because the actual experience of sitting in a courtroom while testimony is given and evidence is entered is largely a procedural exercise, conducted at a pace set by institutional process rather than narrative momentum, all punctuated by long intervals of documentary review and sidebar discussions that are inaudible to observers. More, because the specific texture of watching a carefully constructed truth be built in real time from its constituent pieces, presented to 12 people who have no prior context and must assemble their understanding from scratch, is its own particular form of intensity. You watch them learn what you already know. You watch the moment when a piece of evidence lands, when a witness's testimony connects something for them that had been floating unanchored, when the shape of the whole begins to emerge through the accumulation of its parts. She had attended 4 days of testimony. Not all of the trial, which lasted 3 weeks, but the days she judged to be the pivotal ones. The day of Herbert Cassaway's testimony, the day the digital forensics expert walked the jury through the Crestfield financial records, the day Cellini's attorney made his closing argument, and the day the prosecution made its own. Herbert Cassaway's testimony was the day she found the most difficult to sit through, in the specific way that has nothing to do with legal strategy. He was 78 years old, and he testified in the measured voice of a man who has spent decades presenting information professionally and who was applying that professional skill now to the task of describing his own exploitation. He described how Selena had called him on his birthday. He described the coffee. He described the conversations in which she had explained the opportunity with the particular patient clarity of a teacher who does not condescend, or who makes you feel that your understanding matters to her, that she is taking time with you because you are worth taking time with. He described the moment he understood that the money was not where it was supposed to be. He used the phrase, "I felt like an old fool." And his attorney immediately offered a redirect question that allowed him to clarify that the experience was not evidence of foolishness, but of the effectiveness of the defendant's manipulation. And Cassaway had listened to the question and then said, "I understand that intellectually. I'm telling you how it felt." The jury had been very still during that answer. Nora had been still too. Not because the testimony surprised her. She had read his witness statement in the pretrial disclosure materials that she had requested through her status as a material witness. She had known what he was going to say. She had simply not known, from reading it, what it was going to sound like when he said it in his own voice, in a room designed for exactly this kind of reckoning. She had thought, briefly, about her own 11 years, about the pharmaceutical audit, about coffee and dinners and a hospital waiting room, about being taken time with. She had not allowed the thought to stay longer than it needed to. During the prosecution's closing argument, she had listened to the assistant DA construct the pattern of conduct narrative with the competence of someone who had clearly studied her documentation carefully. The way the argument was structured, moving from the 2021 fraud architecture through the probation period and into the Crestfield scheme, Boa carried the internal logic of a forensic analysis rather than a dramatic retelling. It was effective precisely because it was not theatrical. The jury could follow it the way you follow a well-organized report, and at the end of it, they understood not just what Celine had done, but how she had done it, and what the shape of her willingness to do it again revealed about the specificity of her intentions. After the verdict, the assistant DA had found Nora in the hallway outside the courtroom and shaken her hand and said, quietly, that the documentation she had submitted was the most useful private evidentiary contribution she had seen in a probation violation case. Nora had said thank you. The assistant DA had paused and then added, "You really thought this would happen, didn't you? Why, when you dropped the original charges?" Nora had considered the question for a moment. "I thought it was the most probable outcome," she said. "Given everything I knew about the situation, I tried to make sure it was documentable when it did." The assistant DA had nodded, with the expression of someone who was deciding whether to say something further and deciding not to. She had shaken Nora's hand again and walked back through the courtroom doors. The restitution recovery from the 2021 judgment, as she had calculated it, covered 68% of what remained after the 5 on-schedule payments. The remaining 32% was a number on a balance sheet. She had the civil judgment for it and could continue enforcement proceedings against assets that might become available during Celine's sentence, all including any income earned through prison labor programs, which was minimal but technically subject to judgment attachment. She kept the judgment active through her civil attorney on an annual retainer arrangement. The shortfall itself she had absorbed into her operational accounting the year the dissolution completed. Not as a loss she was dramatic about, but as a line item that accurately reflected what the situation had cost. She did not pretend it hadn't cost anything. She did not perform equanimity about it. She simply kept an accurate ledger, which is what she did with everything. The firm, by the second year, had 8 clients on active retainer and 3 major litigation support engagements ongoing. Revenue was 31% above the highest point it had reached under the Limgrave structure. She attributed this partly to the dissolution, removing the overhead burden of the real estate arm, partly to Delia and James's contribution, and partly to her own slightly heightened professional visibility as a result of her evidentiary role in the Whitmore prosecution, which had been mentioned in a trade publication covering the case, and had produced 12 inbound inquiries in the 6 weeks after the article published. She had responded to all 12. She had taken 4 meetings. She had converted 2 into engagements. The others she had declined for various fit-related reasons that she documented in her intake notes. She was efficient. She was building. She was, in the specific sense that matters, undamaged. The accounting of what the entire sequence had cost her was something she had done once, formally, on a Sunday in January, made with a fresh legal pad and the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for client work. She had listed the items in 2 columns. The first column, the $860,000 stolen, of which she had recovered approximately 68% of the remaining restitution after the 5 completed payments, leaving a net unrecovered loss of roughly $211,000. The legal fees for the civil litigation, the criminal complaint process, and the dismissal proceeding, $87,000. The cost of the forensic digital investigation she had commissioned for the signature key extraction event, $22,000. As the client revenue lost during the turbulence of the fraud discovery and its aftermath. Approximately $140,000 in billings that either did not close or were paused and never restarted. The estimated revenue impact of the firm valuation depression during the dissolution, more difficult to calculate precisely, but she had estimated it at between $60,000 and $90,000 in equity she received at a discounted assessment. Total measurable financial loss, at the high end of her estimates, approximately $560,000. This was money she had earned through 14 years of professional work and had invested in a business that a trusted colleague had partially consumed. The second column was harder to list, but she listed it anyway because she believed in complete accounting. Time: an estimated 900 hours over 22 months of evidence building, monitoring, documentation, consultation with attorneys, and trial attendance. Relationship infrastructure: one marriage, one business partnership, a professional network that had required significant reconstruction, and a decade-long friendship that had never been what it appeared to be. The specific kind of ongoing ambient cost that comes from spending 2 years of your professional life managing the consequences of someone else's choices rather than entirely advancing your own. She had looked at both columns for a long time. Then she had turned to a third page and written, in the flat documentary style she applied to everything, what was built in the same period. The documented evidence package that had contributed to a 10-year sentence. I got the internal control protocol that now protected her firm against the specific class of fraud she had experienced, the legal and forensic knowledge she had developed about elder financial exploitation, securities solicitation law, and probation enforcement that now made her a more capable professional in adjacent engagements. The professional relationship with Marcus Chen that had deepened from occasional collaboration to something more specifically useful. The rebuilt firm, cleaner and more structurally sound than the original, with analysts she had selected and trained herself, with client relationships that were hers alone and not shared with anyone whose loyalty she had not fully tested. She had closed the legal pad and put it in the filing cabinet where she kept documents that were for her records only. The loss was real. And now the accounting was complete. She moved on. The last time anyone asked her directly about Celine Whitmore was at a professional event in the spring of the second year after the sentencing, an industry reception where a man she barely knew approached her with a glass of wine, and the particular confidence of someone who has decided a topic is interesting enough to override social convention. He asked her how it felt to watch someone go to prison for 10 years as a result of her own refusal to stop. She had looked at him for a moment. "I didn't watch someone go to prison," she said. "I documented what I observed through legal means and submitted it to the appropriate authorities." The court determined the sentence. "That's a very careful way of putting it," he said. "Yes," she said. Oh, he seemed to want something more from her. Some admission of triumph or satisfaction, or at least some visible feeling about it that he could interpret and categorize. She offered him none of it. Not because she was performing restraint, but because the feeling he was looking for had never arrived in quite the shape he was imagining. There was no triumphant moment. There was a sequence of decisions made in sequence toward an outcome she had assessed as probable, and then worked methodically to make possible. The outcome had occurred. She had closed the file. She excused herself from the conversation and went to refresh her drink. Outside, through the reception venue's tall windows, the city in spring was doing what it did. Moving, humming, indifferent to the specific calculus of any individual person's gains and losses, all proceeding according to its own enormous logic. She stood at the window for a moment with her new drink in her hand and looked at the lights beginning to come on in the buildings across the street as the evening deepened, and she thought, "I have a 30-page report to finish before Friday." She finished her drink. She said goodbye to the 2 people at the event she had genuine professional regard for. She collected her coat from the rack by the door. She walked out into the city and toward the parking structure where her car was waiting. She put her hands on the wheel. She started to drive. The road was clear and the city was doing what it always did, moving around her with the indifference of a thing too large to notice any individual thread running through it. She drove with both hands and the radio off, and the particular quality of attention she gave to driving, which was the same quality she gave to everything, sufficient and no more. The streetlights came on in sequence as she moved through intersections. Somewhere to her left, a siren began and faded. The parking structure of her building was warm and smelled of concrete and motor oil, and she pulled into her space and sat for a moment with the engine idling. She had a 30-page report to finish before Friday. She had a staff meeting Thursday morning. She had a preliminary consultation call on Wednesday with a potential new client. A family business in a dispute with a former partner over asset valuation. A situation she had handled variations of 11 times in the past 4 years. She knew what the first 3 questions she would ask them were. She knew what documents she would need within the first 2 weeks. She knew how long it would take to build the forensic picture and what it was likely to show, not in specifics but in structural probability, because she had seen enough of these situations to understand their shapes. She turned the engine off. She took the elevator to her floor and unlocked her apartment and set her bag on the counter in the kitchen, which was quiet and orderly and entirely hers. She had chosen the apartment with the specific attention she gave to decisions that would affect her daily function: proximity to the office, natural light in the workspace, a kitchen designed for actual cooking rather than aesthetic photography. She had moved in 14 months ago and had made no changes except to add 2 bookshelves and replace the light fixture above the desk with something that produced the color temperature she needed for extended document review. She made tea. She sat at her desk. She opened the 30-page report and scrolled to page 18, where she had stopped before the reception and read the last paragraph she had written to orient herself. Then she put her hands on the keyboard. She started to type. The probation period began in March. Celine moved back into the apartment she had purchased with stolen money, which was an irony that the court had not required her to address, because Nora's dismissal of the criminal charges had removed the context that would have made asset forfeiture applicable. The civil restitution judgment was a separate matter, with its 3-year payment schedule, and the first installment of $24,000 was paid promptly in April. On time, clean. The kind of clean that announces itself. Nora received notification of the payment through her attorney. She noted it in her encrypted file and moved on. In May, Celine accepted a position at a firm called Alcott Meridian Group, a private wealth management firm that operated primarily for high-net-worth clients in the metropolitan area. The position was listed as Senior Financial Analyst, not a fiduciary role, not a signatory role, clean on its face. She had notified her probation officer within 72 hours, per requirements. She had disclosed the employer, the role title, and the compensation. Her PO had reviewed it and approved it. The firm had conducted a background check that surfaced the conviction. They had documented their awareness of it and confirmed that the role description was compliant with her probation conditions. This was all correct. Nora noted it without reaction. What Nora also noted, because she had a professional contact at the state's securities licensing body who owed her a favor from a forensic engagement 2 years earlier, was that Alcott Meridian Group had a particular client acquisition structure. It was a boutique firm. Its analysts were not merely analytical. They were expected to manage client relationships, which in practice meant they had substantial access to client communication channels and account documentation, even without formal signatory authority. The distinction between access and authority in a firm of that size, Nora knew from experience, was frequently blurry in daily practice, not because the firm was negligent necessarily, but because small private wealth firms operated with lean staffing and trusted their senior people extensively. She noted this. She updated her encrypted file. She set a secondary alert through a third-party financial monitoring service she had used professionally for years. Keyed to public financial filings and corporate registration databases in 3 states, searching for any entity that shared formation agents, registered addresses, or nominee directors with the original Brightfield GSF or Marengo structures. She paid her alert subscription from a personal account unconnected to any professional entity and set the notification to go to a separate email address she had created for this purpose. Then she went back to her work. Her work in this period was going through its own reconstruction. The discovery of the fraud and the subsequent public nature of the civil suit had created turbulence for Limgrave Advisory Group that could not be fully contained. 3 clients had paused engagements. 1 had terminated. Gabriel's real estate portfolio arm had survived largely because its banking relationships were separate from the operating accounts that Celine had touched, and Raymond Whitmore's family investment remained stable, which Nora registered with the particular clarity of understanding exactly why it remained stable. She did not argue with Gabriel about any of this. She had conversations with him that were professional and precise and without emotional texture, and she watched him interpret this as evidence that things were improving, that the storm was passing, that Nora was moving on. This told her something useful about the limits of his perceptiveness, which she filed away for future reference. She also, in June of that year, quietly engaged a family law attorney named Priscilla Osei, whose office was in a building on the east side of the city and whose practice Nora had vetted with the same systematic rigor she applied to everything. The engagement was preliminary, an information-gathering consultation. She came away from it understanding the structure of what a separation from a co-founder and co-owner of a jointly held advisory firm would require in terms of business valuation methodology, ownership agreement clauses, and the specific provisions of their jurisdictional marital property statute as it applied to business interests built partly before and partly during the marriage. She made no decisions, she gathered information, she updated her file. Summer passed. Celine made her second restitution payment on schedule. She had begun attending a professional women's networking group in the city, which Nora was aware of through the ordinary ambient awareness of professional proximity. She had attended 2 industry conference panels, presenting herself as a recovered professional, a narrative that played better than it deserved to, given the specifics of her recovery. She was not publicly identified as a fraud convict because the criminal records, while technically public, were not indexed to her professional profiles, and the charges had been structured under a plea that minimized public exposure. Raymond Whitmore's legal team had negotiated this with characteristic competence. Nora did not attend any of the same events. She had no interest in being in Celine's peripheral vision. She had removed herself from all shared professional circles with the efficiency of someone reassigning file folders, not with drama. When mutual acquaintances mentioned Celine's name in conversation, Nora's expression did not change. What changed in August was her monitoring alert. She was in her office at 7:40 in the morning, working through a complex fraud assessment for an insurance client, when the notification came through to her secondary email. She checked it on her phone under the desk without interrupting the professional conversation she was simultaneously having, which was a skill that looked like calm and was actually something more granular: the ability to assign tasks to separate threads of attention without either thread degrading. The alert was a corporate registration filing. A new LLC registered in Nevada named Crestfield Advisory Solutions. The registered agent matched one she recognized, a Nevada formation service that had also been used for the original Brightfield entity. This could be coincidence. Formation agents used by fraudsters are often used by thousands of legitimate businesses because they are competent and affordable. She did not make assumptions. She flagged it and scheduled a deeper search. As of by the following morning, she had identified additional data points. The LLC had been registered with an address in Nevada that was a mail forwarding service. The organizer name on the filing was not the same nominee used before, but the surname was the same as a woman who had been Celine's college roommate, a detail Nora had documented during her original investigation. The operating agreement listed on the registration was filed with a standard template service used by a specific business formation attorney in Nevada, whose other formation work overlapped with GSF Management Solutions. None of this was proof of anything. It was a pattern. Patterns were Nora's professional language. She opened a new document in her secure notes application and began building a timeline that started in March and now had its first new data point in August. She labeled it with a case number she assigned herself and a notation that she updated with each new entry. Phase 2. Phase 2 did not require her to do anything except watch and document. She was not a law enforcement officer. She was not authorized to investigate anything. She was a private individual who happened to have extensive professional knowledge of financial forensics, and who was using that knowledge to observe and record publicly available information and her own professional monitoring tools. Everything she was doing was legal. She had confirmed this with Priscilla Osei in their second conversation, during which she had hypothetically described her monitoring activity and received a confirmation that she already knew but wanted on record. She was clean, she was quiet, she was patient. In September, Celine began building her first Crestfield client. Nora did not know this in real time because she was not inside Alcott Meridian Group and had no access to Celine's internal activities. What she reconstructed later, from multiple sources that she gathered over subsequent weeks, was that Celine had identified a client at Alcott Meridian, an elderly investor named Herbert Cassaway, 78 years old, semi-retired, with a portfolio managed through the firm and a pattern of trusting his advisors with substantial operational latitude, and had begun building a personal relationship with him parallel to her professional one. This was, in the clinical sense, the grooming phase of what would eventually be documented as elderly financial exploitation. Celine brought Cassaway coffee when he came in for reviews. And she remembered the names of his grandchildren. She called him on his birthday. She began presenting herself, gently and incrementally, as the person who truly understood his financial life, the one who took the time, the one he could trust. This was a pattern Nora recognized, not because she had witnessed it in real time, but because it matched precisely the pattern Celine had used with her. The studied warmth, the performed intimacy, the patient accumulation of trusted access. When she later interviewed witnesses and reviewed communications, as part of the evidence package she assembled, she recognized the architecture with the familiarity of someone who had lived inside a version of it. By October, Celine had convinced Cassaway to participate in what she described to him as a supplemental investment opportunity outside the formal Alcott Meridian structure. It was framed as a private client arrangement she offered to a small number of preferred clients, an exclusive positioning that Cassaway, who had spent his professional life in business development and understood the language of exclusivity, found appealing. He transferred $230,000 to an account that Celine controlled through Crestfield Advisory Solutions. This transfer, on its face, was a violation of her probation in 3 distinct ways. First, she had not disclosed the formation of Crestfield to her probation officer. Second, the account she controlled through Crestfield gave her effective signatory authority over funds substantially exceeding the $10,000 threshold specified in her probation conditions. Third, and most significantly, soliciting investment funds from a client of her employer in a side arrangement structured to avoid employer oversight, constituted exactly the kind of fiduciary adjacent activity that her probation terms explicitly prohibited. She had also committed a new crime. Independently of her probation, she had committed securities fraud, wire fraud, and elder financial exploitation under both state and federal statutes. Nora discovered the Crestfield transfer in November, not through any surveillance of Celine's personal activities, but through the secondary monitoring she had established. Undo a wire transfer from a Cassaway family trust, which appeared in an obscure public court filing related to a parallel dispute about the trust's management, a filing that had nothing to do with Celine and that most people would never have located, referenced a receiving account associated with Crestfield Advisory Solutions. The amount was partially visible through the filing's exhibit structure. Nora did not have the specific figures at that point. She had a thread. She did not pull the thread immediately. She documented what she had and then spent 2 weeks thinking carefully about how to proceed. The question was not whether to report it. The question was sequence and source. If she reported it from her personal monitoring, the first question any investigator would ask was how she had found it. And the answer would draw attention to her monitoring apparatus, which, while legal, was also, if examined without context, potentially characterizable as obsessive surveillance of a prior civil litigant. She did not want that characterization. She needed the discovery to come from a source that had independent standing and whose involvement would not suggest a personal campaign. She thought about this for 2 weeks, and then she made one phone call. Marcus Chen had been her colleague before he became a senior investigator with the State Attorney General's Financial Crimes Unit. She had worked with him on 3 cases over a 7-year period and had found him to be the specific kind of meticulous that she respected, not the kind that gets paralyzed, but the kind that builds cases that hold. They were not close friends. And they were professional counterparts with a history of mutual competence, which in her world was more reliable than friendship. She called him on a Thursday afternoon from her office with the door closed. She told him what she had found: the Crestfield registration, its structural echoes to the previous fraud instruments, and the public filing that suggested a large transfer involving a Cassaway family trust. She was careful about her language. She did not present any of this as evidence or allegation. She presented it as a pattern she had noticed through her professional monitoring tools and was relaying to him because it appeared to potentially fall within the jurisdiction of his unit. There was a pause after she finished speaking. "The original case," Marcus said. "You dropped the charges." "I withdrew the criminal complaint," she said. "Oh, the civil judgment stands. Restitution is being paid on schedule." Another pause. "But you've been watching." "I've been monitoring publicly available filings through tools I use professionally," she said. "Which is not the same thing." A longer pause. I'll take a look at the Crestfield filing. Thank you, Nora said. She did not tell him about the full extent of her encrypted documentation, which by that point was over 270 pages of chronologically organized notes, screenshots, financial data extracts, and analytical summaries. She told him what he needed to begin his own independent inquiry. She understood the difference between giving someone a starting point and handing them a package that would make them question the starting point's independence. She had thought about this very carefully. Marcus's inquiry, it had once begun, had the resources and statutory authority that Nora's private monitoring lacked. He could subpoena records, he could compel disclosures. He could coordinate with the Federal Wire Fraud Task Force, which he did within 3 weeks of their conversation after his own review of the Crestfield filing and 2 subsequent public record searches confirmed the pattern she had identified. By December, the Financial Crimes Unit had executed a warrant for Crestfield Advisory Solutions bank records. By January, they had interviewed Herbert Cassaway, who had become aware by then that the investment opportunity had not performed as described because Celine had stopped returning his calls in November. By February, they had subpoenaed Alcott Meridian's internal communications and identified 4 additional clients who had been approached with variations of the same side arrangement proposal. 2 had transferred funds. 1 had declined but not reported it internally. 1 had been in the process of deciding when the investigation began. The total additional fraud amount across identified victims was $612,000. Celine was arrested on a February morning, a year and a day after Nora had signed the dismissal in Conference Room B. The arrest was not dramatic in the way media arrests sometimes are, with cameras and statements and the theatrical staging of handcuffs applied in public view. It was orderly. The agents arrived at Celine's apartment early in the morning. She was taken in quietly. Her attorney arrived at the precinct within 90 minutes, which suggested she had expected something was coming, even if the specific timing had surprised her. Nora knew about the arrest because Marcus called her. He did not call to celebrate with her. He called because she was a material witness to the original fraud pattern, and her documentation of the structural parallels between the 2021 scheme and the current one had become relevant to the prosecution's narrative of deliberate and repeated criminal conduct. He wanted to understand the extent of what she had preserved. I have 294 pages of organized documentation covering March of last year through January of this year, she said, including chronological notes, financial data extracts from public sources, corporate filing records from Nevada and Delaware, and analytical memoranda explaining the structural connections between the prior fraud instruments and the Crestfield entity. A very long pause. Nora, it's all from public sources and my own professional monitoring tools, she said. Every document was legally obtained. I have the source citations appended. I know, he said. She could hear him processing something. Do you understand what this is going to look like to a jury? Like someone who knew what she was looking at and documented it properly, Nora said. He was quiet for a moment. Like someone who was very patient, he said. Yes, she said. That too. She had her documentation shipped to his office the following week in 2 organized binders with tabs and a cross-reference index that his paralegal later told her was the most useful thing anyone had ever submitted to that office. She had not been trying to be impressive. She had just documented things the way she documented things. The prosecution of Celine Whitmore across combined state and federal counts took 11 months to conclude. The case involved probation violation proceedings, which were handled separately and quickly, as they are designed to be, and the new criminal charges, which required the full adversarial process. The probation violation hearing came first. It was brief by judicial standards, approximately 4 hours spread across 2 sessions, because the evidence was not ambiguous. But Crestfield Advisory Solutions existed. Celine had formed it without disclosure to her probation officer. The bank account she controlled through it had received $612,000 from identifiable victims. She had not reported the formation, not disclosed the accounts, not sought permission for the investment activities. Each of these failures was a separate violation. The judge hearing the probation matter was not interested in the complexity of the fraud itself. She was interested in whether the specific conditions of probation had been met, and the answer was documented in 4 separate categories of noncompliance. The original plea arrangement had been clear that violation of probation would void the suspended sentence and expose Celine to the full sentencing range under the original charges. Celine's attorney attempted to characterize the Crestfield activities as a misunderstanding of the probation terms, an argument that required the court to believe that a former CFO with a plea agreement specifically prohibiting fiduciary activity and requiring financial disclosure did not understand that forming a private investment management entity and collecting client funds constituted a violation of those terms. The judge declined to believe this. The new criminal charges proceeded through the full trial process because Celine declined to accept the plea offer extended to her in month 3 of the prosecution, which would have resulted in a combined sentence of 4 to 6 years. This decision, made against her attorney's recommendation according to information that eventually became public, was understood by observers of the case as reflecting the same fundamental miscalibration that had produced the original fraud. Celine Whitmore trusted her own ability to manage situations to a degree that reality had not yet corrected. Reality corrected it during the trial. The prosecution presented 3 weeks of testimony and evidence. Marcus Chen's investigators had reconstructed the entire Crestfield operation in documentary detail that mirrored, structurally, the forensic approach Nora had used in the original case. The jury heard from Herbert Cassaway, who testified for 2 hours with the quiet devastation of a 78-year-old man explaining how he had trusted someone he believed genuinely cared about him. They heard from the 2 other clients who had transferred funds. They saw the financial records. They saw the Crestfield operating documentation. They saw the communications between Celine and Cassaway over 14 months that charted the grooming sequence. They also heard, in the prosecution's presentation of the pattern of conduct evidence, the background of the original 2021 fraud. The ghost vendors, the signature key extraction, the 47 pages of evidence that had resulted in a plea but not a trial. Nora did not testify about the original fraud directly. It was presented through documentary evidence and the DA's written record. But her name was in the record. The jury knew that the original victim had withdrawn her complaint. They drew their own conclusions about what that meant in the context of a defendant now sitting before them for a nearly identical scheme. Celine's attorney attempted to exclude the 2021 background as prejudicial. The judge allowed it as relevant to the pattern of conduct argument and to the question of the defendant's deliberateness. The admission of this evidence was one of the prosecution's 3 most significant victories during the trial, and it was not something that would have been possible if the original conviction had proceeded to its full criminal resolution and then been appealed or revised. The fact that the original matter had resulted in a plea with a civil judgment, not a criminal trial, meant that the 2021 conduct could be admitted as pattern evidence without triggering the complex double jeopardy considerations that a prior conviction on the same charges would have raised. Nora had known this when she signed the dismissal. She had read the relevant case law in the week before Conference Room B. She had understood that dropping the criminal charges while preserving the civil judgment created a specific evidentiary posture for any future prosecution. The 2021 conduct was available as pattern evidence without being a prior conviction that the defense could work around. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They returned guilty on all counts. Sentencing was a separate proceeding 4 weeks after the verdict. Nora attended. She sat in the 3rd row from the back, not behind the prosecution or defense table, but to the side, in the public gallery where anyone could sit. She wore a dark gray coat and kept it on because the courtroom was cold, in the way that institutional buildings are cold in early November, thus a baseline temperature that is not quite uncomfortable, but never lets you forget you are inside a building designed for function rather than warmth. The prosecution had submitted a sentencing memorandum requesting a guideline sentence at the top of the applicable range, citing the deliberateness of the conduct, the vulnerability of the victims, the violation of professional trust, and the pattern of behavior that demonstrated the defendant's unwillingness to cease criminal activity even while under active court supervision. The defense submitted its own memorandum requesting the lower range, citing Celine's prior professional accomplishments, her timely restitution payments on the original judgment, and a collection of character letters from professional associates. Nora had read both memoranda because they were public documents and because she reads everything relevant. The judge took 15 minutes in recess before returning for the sentencing portion. When she returned, she was the particular kind of unhurried that suggests someone who has already decided and is now simply organizing the delivery. She addressed Celine directly before announcing the sentence. The words she used were not dramatic. They were the specific language of a judicial officer who is required to explain a decision clearly and on the record, and they covered three things: the severity of the conduct, the particular harm caused to vulnerable victims, and the fact that the defendant had been given an opportunity in 2021 that she had treated as a license rather than a warning. The sentence was 10 years. Celine's expression, and in the moment the number was spoken, did not collapse into tears or harden into defiance. It went through a brief sequence that Nora, watching from the third row, identified as comprehension, then disbelief, then a recalibration attempt, and then the failure of that recalibration. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then Celine's attorney put his hand on her arm, and Celine straightened and became the composed version of herself again, which was the version she inhabited when she needed to perform for a room. The composed version of herself was now going to prison for 10 years. Nora noted this without particular feeling. Not satisfaction, not relief, not the complicated warmth that people expect in these moments. She had finished feeling things about Celine Whitmore approximately 14 months ago in Conference Room B, or when she had decided to let the process run its own course and had simply made sure the course was prepared. The sentencing was not the emotional resolution of anything. It was the final administrative entry in a file she had been maintaining. She made a mental note to close the Phase 2 document and archive it properly. She stood when the gallery began moving. She filed out with the other observers. She walked down the courthouse steps in early November air that smelled of exhaust and approaching rain, and the particular metallic edge that cities have when the temperature drops. And she pulled her coat closed and walked to her car. There were things that happened in the months around the sentencing that she had managed with the same calibrated attention she applied to everything, and these deserve their own accounting because they are, in some ways, more instructive than the Celine matter itself. The civil restitution from the 2021 judgment had been paid on schedule through the first 5 installments. The 6th installment, due in the month of Celine's arrest, was not paid. Nora had anticipated this and had already engaged her civil attorney to begin the enforcement process. The restitution judgment was a court order, not a voluntary agreement, and enforcement mechanisms exist for exactly this situation: wage garnishment, bank levy, and in some jurisdictions, liens against real property. The apartment Celine had purchased was mortgaged, but there was equity. Nora's attorney had filed a lien on that property before the criminal trial concluded. When Celine went to prison and the apartment became an asset she could not maintain, the eventual forced sale produced a recovery that covered approximately 68% of the remaining restitution owed. She calculated the remaining shortfall. It was a number. She moved on. The separation from Gabriel had begun formally in August of the year of the sentencing, 7 months before the trial concluded, and approximately 3 months after she had returned to Priscilla Osei's office and moved from preliminary consultation to active engagement. The decision had not been precipitated by a single event or conversation. It had been the accumulated reading of a situation that no longer computed to anything she wished to remain inside. Gabriel was not a bad person in the global sense. He was a specific kind of person, one who measured everything by its proximity to comfort and who, when comfort required a particular alignment with family power, aligned without significant internal conflict. This was not malice. It was the architecture of someone who had never been asked by his own character to do something genuinely difficult. She did not blame him for being the person he was. She simply had no interest in spending her remaining professional years in a business partnership and domestic arrangement with someone whose definition of loyalty was situational. The business dissolution was complex. Limgrave Advisory Group had to be formally valued by an independent assessor, which Nora insisted upon and had already identified the assessor for before engaging Priscilla. The valuation process took 4 months and produced a number that reflected the damage the fraud and its aftermath had done to client retention and revenue. Gabriel accepted the valuation without significant dispute, which surprised his own attorney and did not surprise Nora at all. The real estate portfolio arm was separated from the advisory business formally, with Gabriel retaining the real estate component and Nora receiving the forensic advisory practice and its remaining client relationships in exchange for a structured buyout that compensated Gabriel for his equity share in the advisory business at the assessed valuation. The mathematics of this were painful in the technical sense because the valuation was depressed. She paid for what she received at a price that reflected the damage that Celine's theft had caused. This was an accurate accounting of loss. She took it accurately. She retained the firm's name. She let Gabriel take the real estate arm, which had Raymond Whitmore's investment threaded through it, and which she did not want anywhere near her professional practice. She did not tell Gabriel this last part. She simply did not include the real estate arm in what she asked for. He thought she was being generous. She was being strategic, which is not the same thing, but frequently looks similar. The divorce itself finalized in November, 2 weeks after the sentencing. The timing was coincidental. Both proceedings had been in motion for months and had arrived at their respective conclusions through their own internal timelines. But she was aware, as she sat in Priscilla's office reviewing the final dissolution paperwork, that she was closing 2 files in the same 2-week period. She found this appropriate. Both matters had begun from the same root cause, a person using proximity to access what she had built. Both had concluded through the same basic mechanism, the application of patient-informed process to an intractable problem. She signed the dissolution documents with the same blue ballpoint pen she had used in Conference Room B. She had kept it in her desk drawer for 14 months. Priscilla had offered her an elegant rollerball, and she had declined without explanation. The rebuilt practice took 8 months to stabilize, and another 6 to grow past what it had been before. She had expected this timeline. She had modeled it during the dissolution negotiations and used it to structure the buyout payments to Gabriel in a way that front-loaded the periods when her cash flow would be strongest and deferred payment periods that overlapped with her projected rebuilding phase. Gabriel's attorney had not caught this in the payment schedule. Gabriel himself certainly hadn't. She did not point it out. The schedule was what she had proposed, and they had accepted. She hired 2 new analysts in the spring following the sentencing. One was a forensic accountant named Delia Park, no relation, who came from a Big 4 firm and had the specific quality Nora valued most in subordinates. She asked questions until she actually understood something, rather than signaling understanding she didn't have. The other was a digital forensics specialist, a 28-year-old named James Obie, whose ability to reconstruct digital financial trail from server metadata was, in Nora's assessment, the best she had seen in someone under 35. She also updated her firm's internal financial controls. She installed a multi-party authorization requirement for all wire transfers above $3,000. She retained an external auditor for quarterly spot checks. She implemented a role segregation protocol in which no single employee could initiate and approve the same transaction. These were standard controls that any competent organization should have. She had had them before Celine. Celine had circumvented them through the signature key extraction during the system migration, which had been a window that opened because of a specific IT process. Now, she closed that window by restructuring the migration protocol itself and requiring an external auditor's presence during any future system transition involving credential access. She wrote the new protocol herself over a weekend in a document that was 17 pages long. She thought, while writing it, about all the ways a person with Celine's specific knowledge and patience could find around it. She addressed each of those ways in the protocol. It was not paranoia. It was the application of adversarial thinking to system design, which is what you do when you understand how things fail. Her practice was not going to fail that way again. She also did something that she had not initially planned, but that became clear to her as necessary about 6 months after the sentencing. She gave a talk, a professional address, not public, to a private group of women CFOs and financial directors at a closed-session conference organized by a women's executive network she had been a member of for several years. The talk was not about her personal experience. It was about the forensic architecture of internal financial fraud, with specific focus on fiduciary theft by trusted insiders, and how the structural vulnerabilities that enable such fraud are often created by the same qualities that make an organization effective: trust, efficiency, and the delegation of authority to competent people. She presented the material with clinical precision. She used no case studies that could identify any parties, including herself. She explained how ghost vendor structures are built and how they can be identified from specific patterns in payment timing, the vendor contact information structure, and the relationship between approval thresholds and invoice amounts. She explained how digital signature credentials can be compromised through system migration events and how to protect against it. She explained how forensic cash flow analysis can detect siphoning through indirect means, even when direct records have been altered. The room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when people are processing things through the filter of their own professional situations rather than abstractly. She had expected this. 2 women came to her afterward to ask follow-up questions that were transparently about their own organizations. She answered both of them with the same completeness she would apply to a paid engagement. It was not charity or altruism. Thus, it was the understanding that if Celine's methods spread or replicated or were applied to other organizations by people who had absorbed them from proximity to Celine, the only antidote was the dissemination of exactly this kind of structural knowledge. She had a professional interest in fraud being harder to commit. She also had a human one, which she did not articulate, because articulating it would have required a vocabulary adjacent to healing or meaning, and she had no patience for either of those framings. She had a practice to run and 2 new analysts to develop and a 17-page internal control protocol to implement. She got back to work. It would be a tidier account if she reported that she never thought about Celine again after the sentencing. But she did think about her, occasionally. It's in the flat, analytical way she thought about other past professional encounters, as a case, a variable, a data point in the longer curve of understanding about how people operate. She thought about the very first audit they had worked together, 11 years earlier, and Celine walking her through records with the particular fluency of someone who understood exactly where the edges were. She thought about all the coffee and the dinners and the years of professional reciprocity, and she thought about what it means to inhabit a relationship with a person who has simultaneously assigned you a different role in a script you cannot see. The conclusion she arrived at was not particularly comforting, but it was accurate. The inability to detect performance is not evidence of stupidity. It is evidence that the performance was excellent. Celine Whitmore was, in the specific domain of interpersonal financial predation, extraordinarily capable. The 11 years of accumulated warmth and professional regard had been, in some portion that Nora could not fully quantify, genuine. The relationship had served Celine, and people are capable of genuinely valuing what serves them, even while using it. These 2 things are not incompatible. They just require you to abandon the comfortable belief that love and exploitation are mutually exclusive. She did not find this comforting. She found it accurate. She had learned to prefer accuracy. She also thought, occasionally, about the mechanics of the decision she had made in Conference Room B, not with doubt, which would have been unproductive, but with the clean retrospective interest of an engineer examining a structure that performed as designed. The signing of the dismissal had been a calculated bet on one specific reading of Celine's psychology, that she would not be able to operate within the constraints of her probation because the constraints themselves were incompatible with the compulsive architecture of her particular pathology. Nora had been correct. She acknowledged, because she was honest, that she could have been wrong. If Celine had actually reformed, or had left the financial industry entirely, or had moved to another country and rebuilt her life outside Nora's professional orbit, the strategy would have produced exactly what it looked like on its face: a victim who withdrew her complaint and received inadequate justice. The bet had paid, but it was still a bet. She kept this in her private assessment of herself. She had been strategic, and she had been right. And those 2 things do not carry a guarantee of always coinciding. The next time she faced a situation requiring this kind of decision, the bet might not pay. She would need to make the decision based on her best reading of the variables and accept that the outcome was not fully in her control. This was the only honest accounting. She kept it close. In the spring of the second year after the sentencing, she received an email. It came through her firm's professional contact channel, which was screened by her administrative assistant, and it had been forwarded to her with a note that simply said, "From a Celine Whitmore, thought you should see this yourself." She opened it in her office with the door closed. I said it was not what she would have expected if she had spent any time expecting things from Celine, which she had not. It was not an apology, not that she would have had any particular use for one. It was not a plea or a request. It was a brief paragraph that read in its entirety, with the impeccable prose structure that Celine had always had, as follows. "I've been told by the facility's counseling program that this sort of communication isn't recommended, so I want to be clear that I'm not writing for any therapeutic purpose and have no expectation of response. I'm writing because there's an accounting I need to make with myself, and making it requires acknowledging certain things externally rather than just internally. I knew what I was doing from the beginning, not just the second time, the first time too. Oh, the case with the pharmaceutical firm 11 years ago, where we first met, was also mine. You didn't find it because I was careful. I always thought you would eventually. The fact that you didn't change some calculation in my head that I'm still working to understand. I'm sorry for the work you had to do. I am not sure I'm sorry for much else yet, which is something the counseling program says is progress." I believe them provisionally. Nora read it twice. She filed it, not in the Phase 2 documentation, which was closed. In a separate folder, she labeled personal correspondence. She labeled the subfolder with Celine's name and the date and nothing else. She sat for a moment in the particular quiet of her office in spring, with the windows slightly open and the sound of the street 3 floors below coming through intermittently. And she thought about the pharmaceutical audit 11 years ago and the fact that Celine had been walking her through the records with the fluency of someone who understood exactly where the edges were, and this, she had thought at the time, was because Celine was very good. She had been right, just wrong about the explanation. She thought about this for 3 minutes. Then she closed the email and turned back to the financial forensics report she had been drafting for an insurance client before the notification came in. The report was 30 pages in and needed 6 more. She estimated 2.5 hours to complete it. She calculated the time against her afternoon schedule and determined she could finish it before 3 if she was not interrupted again. She put her hands on the keyboard. She started to type.